Darwin, Wallace are two different people, and they both came up with the proposed theory around the same time. And the theory was of natural selection, which is the mechanism is actually natural selection, and the process is evolution. Here's an image of Alfred Wallace, I believe, that was depicted by the books. When we talk about evolution, remember, an individual never evolves. It's always about talking about the population of the same species in an area. One of the proofs that we have of evolution right now is the resistant bacteria. Over the time, the use of abundance use of antibiotics have resulted in strains of bacteria that are resistant to that particular antibiotic. And one of the most common one that you hear a lot is MRSA. MRSA stands for methyl-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's a resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria that's present in a normal flora on everyone. But over the time, the abundance use of antibiotics has resulted with this. So this is a population that is evolving. It's not just one bacteria that's evolving. And once the population has evolved, then it increases the genes within that gene pool. And evolution will result in a change which occurs in the line of descent. So it won't happen right then. It's over the line of defense, over generations, that you see the effect. Natural selection is the mechanism that is used. In natural selection, firstly, it's about survival of the fittest, as I said earlier. And the one that is fit to survive is able to then reproduce among the individuals and pass on to the more likable trait. For example, let's look at this image over here. Now, the moth that is light shade over here is not visible on the surface, the background, which is also a lighter shade. However, the light moth is more visible on a darker bark surface. So guess what happened? If this was the moth in this area, most of these moths will be eaten by the predators. So this moth will be able to survive. On the other hand, if you look at the dark-colored moths, the dark-colored moth in this section will not survive, and in this section, which is on a darker surface, will survive. Same example with the pocket mouse that you can see. So, looking in those images, what we're seeing is that eventually the organism will take all the resource from the environment, and it will be more fit to that or more suitable to that environment, and we call this as adaptation. And individuals all compete for the same resource. Food and shelter is mainly the most important resource that is required by any organism, and shelter mainly from predators. And the ones that are able to produce the new offspring are undergoing the process of, or the mechanism of, natural selection. Sometimes some traits are more adaptive than others. It is just that it's better chances to survive and reproduce, and over generations, adaptive forms of trait will become more common in a population. And some traits are also lost during this process of evolution. The ones that are lost are, for example, the tailbone that we have, or like, for example, the appendix, which is of no use. A lot of the evidence of evolution has come forward by many fossil. What is a fossil? Fossils are mainly specimens of life forms that have deposited over layers of soil and rock, and they're really found in sedimentary rocks. I think this particular image is from a cave in Italy, and you can see the fossil evidence are usually taken out as a piece of rock, sometimes even, and the many fossils are seen over there. The study of the fossils are usually done by anthropologists and geologists who use the concept of carbon dating. Carbon dating means that carbon is the element that's present in all living forms. Now there is a ratio of a radioisotope of carbon 15 versus, actually it's not 15, it's carbon 14. Carbon 14 versus carbon 12, which is a normal form. So the ratio is measured in living organisms as of now, and when a fossil sample is there, usually carbon 14 accumulates. Carbon 14 is a radioactive isotope. So if the sample has more carbon 14 versus the carbon 12 ratio, then a geological survey is done which shows how old that specimen is. More evidence of evolution comes from the study of comparative morphology. Comparative morphology is pretty much comparing the different structures and the different shapes of the major organisms, and in order to do that we see some common patterns in there. For example, in this image over here, you can see it's taken from different aspects, from an elephant, human, bat, porpoise, penguin, chicken, and so forth. Similar body parts that are shown in this image over here reflect that they share a common ancestry, and this terminology is homologous. Homologous always means that structures may be used differently in different groups, but the very same genes direct their development. So they're not all going to be doing the same kind of movement, but they have the same common descent. This is homologous. On the other hand, analogous structures show that these they have similar body parts, and they have evolved independently of each other, and this shows that there was a linear diversion of the lineage, that it divided and gave different ways of performing the same function, perhaps. And these are the analogous structures that are shown over here, which is a bird wing and an insect wing. The evolutionary tree that is shown on the bottom shows that wings evolved independently in the three separate lineages that either led to the bats or the birds or the insects. What is mutation? Another concept I want to go over in this chapter. Mutations are generally changes in the molecules of the DNA, and these DNA changes are inherited during the time of cell division or nucleic acid replication, and most of the time these mutations will result in variation in the population. So all the images that you see over here are because of mutations and offspring having different shades of the feather. Again, all of us that none of us are shown in this image, but if you can imagine, all of us are different because we have some variations in the gene pool in our own population, and the variation of the gene pool comes from that 98% of the gene that I mentioned in the previous section when I mentioned that the human genome has 2% gene that makes sense, and there's 98% of the genes that do not make sense, and sometimes that leads to polymorphism. However, there are mutations that are lethal, and lethal mutations will often lead to death. Natural mutations, on the other hand, will not help or not hurt. It just creates more variation in the population. So when does population not evolve? A population is stable if it reaches an equilibrium where no conditions have changed, the environment is the same, the food and the shelter required for the organism is the same, and if it remains static forever, probably then a population will not evolve. We know that that doesn't happen, especially with the global warming situation, with all those in the change in the climate, change in the temperature, change in the plantation. With all of these are linked into a very broad picture of the food web, which will then result in modification and survival of the most favorable trait in many species. So this concludes our little topic about evolution. I make sure you watch some of the animations and you do your work for this section.